It is Sunday, April 26th, and it's getting pretty late with Jake Landau. We are here with a new guest today. His name is Richie Assaly. He's a freelance writer, politics and culture writer, and he's here today to talk about a piece he's written for Toronto magazine The Grind called Cops Keep Showing Up to Arts Events About Palestine. What can organizers do? Question mark. Richie, great to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. I mean, obviously the story isn't exactly a happy one, but I'm always happy to have
Mhm.
journalists on to talk about their work. And like, this is a pretty important story because, as someone who supports Palestine myself, I don't participate in these events anymore because now I usually go to cover them instead with my camera and my media badge. But I have surely been witnessed with my face unmasked at these events, and I'm sure police have surveilled me there, and this is apparently becoming a more common thing.
Yeah, one thing I want to really emphasize about this article because it did really kind of go somewhat viral for within the Canadian media world. And it was a lot of people seemed quite shocked by it or quite disturbed by it. A lot of media figures were sharing it, saying this is really who don't typically weigh in on this sort of thing. We're sharing it and sort of expressing shock. And one thing I do want to make clear is like for people who are organizing around Palestine and have been for the last few years, this isn't like a surprise. This sort of
Right.
thing has been happening at protests, obviously, but also at you know um, academic talks or cultural events. Um,
Mainstream media just hasn't cared.
yeah, and I think there is something about sort of, TIFF that, it's a comedy fundraiser at a beloved comedy bar. So, yeah, no, I think for folks who haven't read the story, maybe I can just kind of quickly say what the story is about.
Yeah.
Um, so on the same night, on April 4th, which was a Saturday night, we got a tip that a comedy show called Stand Up for Gaza was a fundraiser for children in Gaza, the Gaza Soup Kitchen, I believe. It happens every other month, I think,
I
and
think,
they've raised.
according to the article, it says here it happened monthly, and this was just after 10
Yes,
p.m. ish.
that's right. Yeah, so this is a monthly uh event, and they've raised I think 10 grand over the last few years, and it's stand-up comedians donating their time, telling some jokes, and raising money for a good cause. At about just after 10 p.m., before the show was about to start, two cops showed up in the lobby and started kind of asking around who's hosting this. I spoke to the person who was hosting that evening. She said, this was a pretty intimidating thing to have to deal with. And they kept asking, are you guys, when are you guys planning to march? What's the plan here? When are you guys going to march? And she said, it's 10 p.m. It's raining out. We're not marching
It's not a
anywhere. We're doing
march, it's a
it. Yeah, yeah,
fundraiser. It's a comedy bar. They're telling jokes.
yeah. So they were a little bit confused by that, and the cops didn't really give them a straight answer. And also, the cops didn't return my request for comment on this
When do they
incident. But
ever?
rarely, occasionally, but um, increasingly less with some of my work. But the the people who organized that fundraiser, they kind of pieced things together, and what they assumed happened was that someone might have called the cops, saw the marquee, and just called the cops to kind of cause some issues for them. But then I got a tip shortly after this. It turns out that just a few hours earlier that same night, the police also showed up to the Toronto Palestine Film Festival's screening of Palestine 36, which is this like big acclaimed epic that came out at TIFF last year. Big movie and showing all over the country and all over North America now. And
And the
TPFF
Toronto
did a
Palestine Film Festival was doing a screening of it again at the TIFF Lightbox downtown earlier that same night on April 4th, before those same cops then went to the comedy bar.
Yeah, sorry, not the same cops, not necessarily. I
Oh,
haven't been able, I haven't confirmed that, but it was just another incident where the cops actually showed up for no clear reason. And what they actually did here wasn't just enter the lobby; they actually entered the movie theater and kind of stood in the wings,
hmm.
looking at the audience. And the one of the TPF organizers who I spoke to said she saw the cops, and she's been doing this for 15 years. And cops do show up to certain TPF events pretty with regular frequency, but never have they entered a theater midway through the movie. And she said this was as a viewer, this is like you're watching this very intense drama and you're kind of lost in the movie, and suddenly there's two
You're
police
not going
officers
to
looking at
notice
you.
that. And this actually struck me a fair bit, like more than a comedy burg, because it didn't end up working for my schedule, but I was thinking of going to this
Mhm.
screening of the
Yeah.
movie. So,
Hmm.
like, it hits me that, while I would have just been engrossed in this movie, I would have been eating my popcorn, and I wouldn't have probably noticed there were like two cops like down on the floor at the stairs before you walk into the seating, like surveilling us. Like,
And yeah, yeah, it's and so the organizer kind of took him aside and pulled him out and kind of gave him heck. But they said, we're here, we're doing a neighborhood walkabout, we're just making sure everyone's safe, you know, and that's what the organizer told me. They said, again, I wasn't able to get comment from the police who didn't respond to my request, but this idea that people watching this kind of movie would feel safer knowing that police are kind of watching them is just like so absurd that again, we don't know what's happening, but the organizers I spoken to have said that this is happening with a greater frequency in recent months, that the police are showing up to these type of events. And it begs the question, do they have some calendar where they're looking at looking for Palestine events and saying, let's show up there. And
I mean,
if that's true,
once
what is
upon
the
a
purpose?
time in a past organizing life, when I
Mhm,
used to do protests on the lawn of Queen's Park, like they would make you do a meeting with the Legislative Protective Service before you can
mhm.
actually do it. And they very much would surveil
Yeah.
social media and see what events are going on, who's posting about what. So I 100% believe that Toronto police, who are much better resourced than just the Legislative Protective Service, are absolutely monitoring social media for these things. I mean, if you're
Mhm.
advertising it to get a lot of people to come and it's about Palestine, I have no doubt that cops in the city know about it.
Yeah, and so like the question at first was like, let's see if we can try to like figure out what's going on here, and that proved to not be something we were able to do. But the more folks that we spoke to, they kind of emerged a common refrain. Some people are like, we want to push back and tell the police they shouldn't be doing this like without proper reason. Is it even legal to be entering these spaces without a reason? This is kind of murky. And then others are saying this is just the political reality we live in. So, and this isn't a surprise. We know that when, as organizers, we are open about our opposition to genocide or our opposition to, the war, that is a risk. You're always taking a risk when you're doing that. And in 2026, and what instead we need to be focusing on is how to protect ourselves, how to be prepared. And so that was the second half of this article, was speaking to some organizers about some of the tips that they have about how to do these events. Because I've been involved in those type of events where this is a very real possibility. How do we make sure that things don't escalate? How do we make sure that we know our rights? Because I don't think I have to tell your audience this necessarily, but like police showing up does not make a lot of people feel safer. It might
No.
make some people feel safer, but in these spaces, knowing what we know about the history of policing and surveillance of these type of progressive movements, it's seen as intimidation or a way to sort of you know a lot of people who are, and I think that's what made this interesting about too, is like when you're organizing a protest or maybe a academic talk, you might have that sort of risk tolerance or that sort of experience. But if you're someone who wants to show a movie or wants to like put on an art exhibit, um, that's not something that you're used to dealing with. And I think it's a way that and knowing that there is risk associated, I think that scares some people away from doing these kind of things,
Well,
right? This
later
is
in
something.
your piece, you describe in January 2024, one day before a fundraiser for Palestine, cops showed up to an event space, a black run event space, and they started saying, "Oh, this might not be good for your security. You might need metal detectors to keep everyone safe." And then it ended up being moved to a different venue that was unpublicized because clearly the cops made the venue feel too unsafe to actually host the event.
And that's a real problem in Toronto. I think it's very hard to run an event space and run a venue in Toronto these days. Like margins are thin. You can't afford to be, having stuff cancel, et cetera. So I think that for that reason and for other reasons, a lot of venues are worried or don't want to to deal with this
And I
stuff.
can't say that the worry is entirely unfounded because I have experienced Kahanists and other insane people who are very violently Zionists, to put it mildly.
And
People who have pointed out where my mother works by address. You get my idea, what I mean. Like, I mean,
yeah,
there's one incident of the guy with the nail gun.
yeah.
Like, so it's like, yeah, it's I can't exactly blame an event space for being like, is some crazy person gonna come here and try to hurt people?
And I mean, I think that's something that's worth emphasizing too, is like these events aren't violent. These aren't like
No,
you go like some of the like one I spoke to one organizer who works with East End Acts. It's a progressive organization on the East End, and she told me cops show up to all their events and they're just like come to expect it. And this is she said their primary audience is like young families and seniors. Like these aren't people trying to, and they say, and the only time that there is violence or scuffles or incident that might require police is when counter protests show up and start
right.
to try to instigate or sort of inflame tensions to a
It's
point
like
where
I didn't
things do break out.
participate in Al Quds Day because I don't really participate in really protests in general anymore now that I just go to cover them instead. But I went to cover it, and like the main conflict did seem to just come from counter protesters egging people on the other side, and like literally the photo I used for my column like was just a police barricades with a massive wall of cops like between these two sides and between them and the US embassy, and like it
Yeah.
uh, at a certain point, like this obviously isn't a protest, like these are just cultural events, they're fundraisers.
Hmm.
It's saying, hey, we want to fundraise for food for children in Gaza so they don't fucking starve to death.
Hmm. Hmm.
And cops, it's a massive waste of resources, I
Well,
assume,
that's
for
yeah.
cops to be dedicating all this time to surveilling anyone with a slight inkling of being pro-Palestine. But the other thing I wanted to get your opinion on, and the thing this really does make me think about, is like 1950s like McCarthyite Red Scareism, like the are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party, like
Right.
just going to surveil random cultural events that have any even slight leaning that they might be not entirely gung-ho capital. You get what I mean?
I do, and I think the only thing I'd push back, not push back, but like I one thing that I think is worth pointing out is that like I do think there's a divide between how these things are seen at the elite level by police or by politicians or even in mainstream media versus how people on the street see these things. Like a lot of people, this is what I'm saying. Like this is something that people are talking about day to day. This is something that you can't be a fan of music or movies or art
Right.
and not be having this conversation about what's happening in Palestine and in Gaza and and people, I think what I'm trying to say is I think earlier a couple of years ago maybe there was a lot more fear of having your face seen and put on media. What is that doctor or that dentist doing at these rallies? But I do think now that the opinion has shifted so much that like uh it's not working as much. The police are
Right.
still wasting their resources and their politicians are still trying to like come up with these draconian ways of dealing with it. But the people, it's not
There's
like the
simply
move.
too many people who identify this way now
And there, yes, yeah.
it's like whack-a-mole. You can't get all of them.
And I think the movement has just shown really great resilience, like they have had to put up with so much bullshit. Like if you talk to organize, like the amount of like just headaches and lawsuits and even media who have to deal with lobby groups, like it's exhausting, and yet the movement has really shown a resilience that I think you know
Well, I've
um
talked to Jason over from Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East from their media
mm,
team. So, like, I'm
mhm,
well familiar with all the bullshit that
yeah,
media has to put up with from
for
a lot
sure.
of groups about how they're not being pro-Israel enough in their reporting.
And one last thing I wanted to mention about venues too was like I spoke to Mustafa, who is like a pretty big singer. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. Pretty acclaimed Toronto artist who in early 2024 was one of the first kind of big scale musicians who was putting on benefits for Gaza and for Sudan. He is Sudanese, He ended up doing these amazing events in London and in New Jersey that had tons of stars, like major names performing and raising money, and it was like covered by international media. And he's from Toronto, and I spoke to him. I interviewed him for the Toronto Star article, and he told me that the plan was to do this in Toronto. Like that's where he's from, that's where his community is rooted. And he said he couldn't find a single venue who would agree to host something like this. And this is a guy who was like a darling, like a media darling. He was he
And
was
he's hosting it in like big venues in New Jersey and in London.
yes, yeah,
Like it's not like there isn't an audience for it,
no, it would,
especially in
yeah,
his own home city. The idea that no one would want to see it is absurd, and the idea that it can't happen in Canada, but it can happen in the United States and the United Kingdom, two countries that are even more complicit in Israel's actions and also with the UAE's actions in Sudan.
yeah. And this is a guy who's played Massey Hall multiple times. It's a guy who was a former poet laureate of Toronto. Like, he has this cachet, and it really shows how sort of conservative the Canadian landscape is when it comes to this stuff. Obviously, I speak about this a lot, even in terms of media. Like, the United States obviously has its problems in its media, and so does the UK. But there does seem to be a little more space for discourse around this, and for
If you're
opinions
a
that kind of.
citizen.
Yes, yeah, of
Yeah,
course. And
yeah.
but in Canada, it really does seem like if you don't kind of fall into this like narrow lane of acceptable discourse and positions on Palestine, it's very difficult to carve out space around that.
The people who
Um,
have an easier time carving out space to an extent would be people like me who are pro-Palestine Jews. But like we also get unique challenges in that we're called traitors to our kind, which is a characterization I would disagree with. But
yeah,
uh and again, I've already told you about the finding out where my mother works thing.
I'm so sorry.
No,
That's very that.
I try to just be chill about it. But like also like they put me on Canary mission, man. Like so like I get the whole idea of like being targeted for being pro-Palestine, and it really upsets me. And I think you talked earlier about like how this story like blew up in the media because of like a lot of media figures like talking about it on social media. I was one of them.
Mhm.
And like, yeah, it did really get me because I've experienced this personally, and I'm just like, I don't want cops going into a movie. I want to be able to go to a movie or go to a comedy show or listen to music without like cops coming to surveil me. And the question I remember I asked was, were these cops wearing body cameras?
So I again, I can't confirm that. And the witnesses I spoke to said they can't confirm it either.
Hmm.
The one organizer I spoke to said she thinks so, but she's not sure because in these moments it's like,
Right.
yes,
You got to be like
it's
hyper vigilant to be like scanning for all of those things. And it's something you might look on for when the cops do this again the next time. But
Mhm.
it's a new provocation, and like you've said, they're trying to figure out how to develop their responses to this sort of thing. But I know like
And
the body camera thing, why it worries me is because I think in Edmonton they're talking
yeah.
about pairing up the Axon body cameras with AI so they can link it to facial recognition. And the thing I've realized is that whether or not a local police force actually pays for it, if they're paying to have their footage stored in the cloud, I'm sure that American company is doing something with that footage to train their database. They're just charging local cops on access to it for themselves.
I believe the Edmonton police have already purchased that technology, and I
So
actually.
if Edmonton police were to do something similar like this, then you would just be going to a movie if you're not wearing a face mask, and a lot of people wouldn't because they might be eating popcorn or having a drink. Like then you're suddenly in the database for daring to watch a movie about Palestine.
Yeah, yeah. So they're beginning with proof of concept, just to be clear.
Hmm.
So they're
So they want to
piloting out
prove they can
this
violate our rights before they
project,
do it at scale.
this AI facial recognition pilot in Edmonton. So that is already taking place. And yeah, and I'm just looking at a TC article right now, and a key note here is that has reportedly been used for surveillance in Gaza. So, like, the Edmonton police chief recently traveled to Israel to meet with police there, and there's been a lot of backlash to that as well
Right.
because I don't think anyone who's been following the news as a Canadian citizen wants the type of surveillance and type of policing that's happening in the West Bank or Gaza to be in the streets of Canada.
No, because
Um,
I'm like, for clarity, and I've written about this before, everyone. The minister in charge of all police in Israel is a convicted terrorist.
one of the most yeah, convicted terrorist
He took his
who
wife on his first date when he was an adult and she was a teenager to a park dedicated to another terrorist who massacred Palestinians. He is quite literally Satan incarnate. Uh,
I think that's something that was missing from some of the discourse around the Edmonton police officer going there as well. Is he was distancing himself from. He said we didn't meet with any government officials, we didn't meet with any military officials, we were just there with the police. And it's like none of those articles pointed out that the head of the police in Israel is Itamar Ben Gvir,
yeah,
who
he's a lunatic.
is makes Netanyahu look like Barack Obama or something like a centrist.
And what's worse,
This
people
guy
like him and
is
Bezalel Smotrich are actually fairly popular. They're not fringe figures.
yeah.
Like one more thing with Itamar Ben Gvir, he was the lawyer who defended two people who burned a Palestinian family and their baby alive in their home. Then he attended the wedding for their cousins, where people hoisted guns in the air and took turns stabbing a photo of that baby. Again, I wasn't exaggerating when I said this man is Satan incarnate. He is
This is the
genuinely an evil human being.
This is the man who is popping champagne after the new law that allows Israel to execute Palestinian
While wearing a
prisoners
noose lapel
while
pin.
wearing. Yeah.
And
Anyway,
Edmonton
yeah, it's
police
like
have met with the police run by him to learn from their strategies.
it's yeah, it's very strange, and I really wish Toronto has this biggest police budget ever this year, right? That was okayed by this the a progressive mayor Olivia Chow okayed this increase to push the police budget to $1.43 billion. The police are I don't know if you saw the recent thing they put out this weekend. It was like a flashy video showing how at Blue Jays games now the police are going to have long gun rifles and will be patrolling sort of the Rogers Center where the Blue Jays play
Yeah,
as and
I did
there's like
see
this
that, and it does not make me feel safe at all.
So there's this real ramping up we're seeing, and I think that what's frustrating is that that they wouldn't respond to my requests. I know they're busy, but like this this kind of request, this kind of transparency, like maybe if they can answer, at least give me some sort of justification. Was this did someone call the police?
And
Was
to
there
go
a
further, I'm
false threat?
actually, let's not even give them the excuse if I know they're busy. I've reached out to them. They have a dedicated media team for responding to media requests. That's their
Yeah,
job. Like, they're never
yeah.
too busy to respond to media. That's the reason they've been hired for.
Yeah. So, and again, it's like their communications person has contacted me many times in the past. So it's not that it's just because the grind is a smaller outlet and we're used to not
Not that small. Like,
always. Yeah.
as an aspiring freelance writer myself, not quite at your scale, but you guys are pretty great. I like the grind.
Oh, that's very kind. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, it's there's a lot of pieces kind of in play here. I think that that's why this story did strike a note is because it does touch on these sort of various things that are happening. And again, I think it's so important to note that they're not popular things. Like we Torontonians should be concerned about if there's this rise in uh, uh, people shooting synagogues. Like we should be concerned about what's happening there. But to suggest that the solution to that is like having like surveilling the Palestinian movement when there's no evidence connecting these things and having people with machine guns walking around the Rogers Center, like what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
it's like the
this
solution is
sort of
not to
rhetoric.
create a police state where freedoms no longer exist.
And we've seen how the we're already um, you know diminishing our right to protest in certain places with these bubble bylaws or these bubble bylaws, and we're seeing sort of the slow erosion of rights.
And there's the movement to
I
make
think a
that
lot
a
of people
federal
are noting
pass,
that.
bubble bylaws, federal
Mhm.
law, so that it would be now criminally enforceable. And like it's blatantly a charter violation, but the government doesn't care. They won't admit it
Yeah,
because then they would just use the notwithstanding clause. But
yeah. And we have the data that shows that, like, after 2.5 years of the pro-Palestine massive protests, thousands, tens of thousands of people, and it's been remarkably peaceful. And the I think there's been about 179 or so arrests that the police have tracked, and of those numbers, like, the vast majority have been tossed out, or I think there's been like maybe 2 convictions or something like that. And just like the amount of resources that are going into charging people and then having them go through the court system just to get tossed out, saying there's no evidence of this, there's no,
and
you
the
know what I
money
mean?
gets
It's
bled out of everything else the city has to do.
mhm. and And even the police will admit this. There was that Solicitor General emails that came out, I think, in January, where he was pushing the Toronto police to crack down on
Yes,
hate movements or
Michael
something.
Kersner. And to be fair, he represents a riding with a lot of conservative
Mhm,
Jews who I know and who I don't agree with, but they're part of my community. Who very much they don't think charter rights should apply to pro-Palestine anything, and
mhm,
they think the
mhm,
cops should just and you write in here about how there's a perception that cops are policing these pro-Palestine spaces, if not cracking down completely, but just to satisfy this political demographic. But also, you have pointed out that the Toronto police had to respond to the Solicitor General in Ontario and say, we can't legally do that, actually, which
mhm.
is
That's right,
insane
yeah.
because usually the cops are not the ones drawing the line on civil rights.
I think that was really eye opening, and him saying, the police chief saying, we are already doing that. We are already taking this very seriously, and yeah, this I don't know. It makes you wonder how this works. Like, if there's always going to be this push from one group trying to push the envelope even further, eventually that line does inch that direction. And I think that that's why a lot of organizers really are pushing back and standing, and trying and doing great work to highlight this and to not give an inch when as much as they can. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess in closing, I guess the important part, and you touched on this before, but like they're talking about how they will respond to police presence increasing at these events and getting more intrusive. And as the organizers you talk to say, it's like we have to acknowledge there will always be an inherent risk to this, but the more
Mhm,
numbers we have, the harder it will be to shut us down.
mhm.
And I,
And I think,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, and I think that people are going out to see these films and these events, and like, I think there is a
Well, the
real,
movie was sold out.
absolutely, yeah. I think there is a real hunger among people to to show their support and to engage on this issue.
Or even just to
And
see Palestinian cultural works.
absolutely. And I think there is a shift taking place. And so I remain, like, optimistic about the resilience of the movement. And, and I think that these incidents that I highlight in the article, why they struck such a nerve is because people are not falling for it anymore. You know what I mean?
There's not
They're
popular support for this kind of crackdown. The vibe has shifted.
Yes, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that is a rare optimistic note to end on for it's getting pretty late with Jake Landau podcast. Richie, thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about your piece. Folks, you can read it in thegrindmag.ca. The link will be in the podcast description. Thank you again, Richie. This has been Richie Assaly, freelance writer, political and cultural topics. And that'll do it for this week's episode. Thank you for listening, everybody. You can catch the next episode, the same place you caught this one, wherever you get your podcasts. And we will see you next Sunday. Cheers. This is the end of the show. Bye.